Are you coming in? '23. Okay, Capper, mute your phone. Mute yourself, put your cell phone. Focus, disturb. Here we go. Okay, 24. Let me see. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rabbi Mo Capro. I'm the executive director of NAJC, and we are very happy to welcome you here to our fourth topic on dementia, which is going to be working with families of patients with dementia. We're very proud to be able to present this through the wonderful and generous grant that we received from the Sephardic Foundation on Aging. At this time, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Nancy Kriseman, a licensed social worker who has been in this field for over 40 years, working with families with dementia and other such important programs. It gives me great pleasure to introduce her to you right now. So Nancy, the show is yours.
Thank you. Before we actually start, one of the things that I really wanted to do was to ask the audience participants, how many of you, when working with families with dementia, what would be some of the challenges that you find that maybe perhaps you get a little stuck around, or just might want to bring forth today so that we can make sure that I cover it and we talk about it some. So I asked Rabbi Mo if he would gather some of those challenges, if you would write them in the Q&A, then he can read some of them out loud, and I will jot down some of them myself before we actually start my presentation.
So the first one is getting a patient to eat.
Okay. All right. Because they lack focus and they don't really understand, or the food gets in their mouth and it stays in there and they don't swallow. That can happen.
Coming in. Families who get frustrated when they try to redirect or correct resident confusion.
Okay, redirect or correct. Okay, confusion. Okay.
Families families become angry when they don't remember when the patient doesn't remember who they are, where they are, when they repeat themselves.
Okay. Okay.
Caregivers need respite and a short supply of in-home providers.
Yes.
Navigating different understandings of what's going on among the adult siblings.
Okay.
The spouse who refuses to acknowledge that the other spouse has dementia.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Family denials of the severity of dementia.
Yes.
Another issue is motivating loved ones to engage in healthy behaviors.
Okay.
Insisting the family respect the values and the former wishes of the patient and respect the patient as an adult.
Yes.
That's a biggie.
Yes.
Yeah. We have family denials of severity of dementia. We've already talked about it. We've already mentioned that.
Okay. I think those are great to start with, and certainly we can, when we do the Q&A towards the end of the presentation, if there's some additional things. I think I'll be covering a good deal of this. It's always a challenge to figure out how to do this in an hour when there's, I could spend days and days, and as all of us know. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and please bear with me. I'm a little bit tech challenged, but Ellison has been trying to help me here. So I'm going to share my screen and pull up the PowerPoint, which I did. And I decided to talk about the title even, how to best support families caring for someone with dementia. And the reason I use the word best even to start with is there's no right or wrong way when you're trying to help families, nor is there a right or wrong way for families to interact and be with folks. And what we want to try to get to is a place of best. And I tell that to my clients all the time. So I will go to the next slide. I hope. Slide control, why isn't it going next? Okay. Can't seem to get it to, there we go. So, yeah, I got it now. Caring for someone with dementia can be a long and winding road lasting many years. And I can tell you that from my own experience. My mother was diagnosed at the age of 70, about 71, 72 with probable Alzheimer's. And she was a very healthy person, always very active, and there was longevity in her family. So I had a feeling I was going to be having to go on this journey with her for quite a long time, and I did. Lasted close to 14 or 15 years. And so we're going to talk a little bit about, you know, how we really support families, particularly when it can be such a long and winding road. And what I wanted to do was pull up for you all, and then I'll go into more detail, some of the ways that dementia impacts the family. There's grief and loss, knowing where the person is on what I call the dementia abilities continuum, which I've kind of created myself. I mean, there's stages to dementia. I've created what I call an abilities continuum because I really want to look at what are people still able to do, and even when they're unable, there's things that you can do with them to help them still feel like their life matters. So I talk about more abled, less abled, and unabled, and I'll share more about that as we go on. And then really important to recognize the different relationships that each family has with the person with dementia, and to be aware that not everybody has a wonderful relationship, that there are some family members that might have had, you know, an abusive, or there was neglect with the person who's living with dementia towards the adult children or even the spouse. And so we really, I worry about when we talk about loved ones, because sometimes they don't feel that this person was a loved one. Being aware of how the role as a spouse or partner, friend, or adult changes, adult child changes. That's a huge thing. And helping as caring professionals, trying to help our families really deal with those changes and learn how to be patient and more flexible and that sort of thing. And learning, you know, kind of how to let go. And we will absolutely go into more detail around role changes for sure. And then there's the communication changes, which can be very difficult as a person's cognition declines. Then sometimes it's harder for them to share what they want to say to you. They have more language issues and processing issues. And again, to try to help families recognize that and let go of their expectations of, you know, I remember one gentleman I was working with, and the wife was telling me he was a professor at Emory, and he actually, I think he was a language professor, and he was losing his words. And it was a tremendous loss for her to see him in that sort of situation. And then another biggie that I work a lot with, and this is particularly for social workers that are on this, is the decision-making in terms of helping these families deal with taking away the car, which is a huge thing, particularly for what I call the older generation of people. that are 85 plus. I mean, I know a lady that's in my practice right now, she's 95 and she's still driving. However, I have made her take not made her, but I've suggested that she take a driver test, which she has done. She gets her eyes checked, that kind of thing. Finances, another biggie, oftentimes trying to get people to recognize that they no longer can manage their finances and you don't want them getting taken advantage of. And then another one that families really struggle with is when to move the person to memory care or assisted living if they no longer can really take care of somebody in their home, or nursing home for that matter, when to move them there. It's particularly painful for spouses. And so we'll touch on that. And then bringing in a professional caregiver into the home. I can recall many times when I've tried to get these caregivers into the home and the person with dementia doesn't understand why they need somebody there. I can remember one caregiver, she had called me and she said, Nancy, the person has me sitting outside her apartment on a chair and I can't get in. And so, having to coach families and professional caregivers on how to deal with some of that. So let's sort of dig in to some of these different ways that dementia impacts families. And we start with the roles. And one of the things that I want us to be aware of today is that there's a really big difference between how the roles change for spouses and partners and how they change for adult children, perhaps friends, colleagues, that kind of thing. And what I have found is that they're all not easy. So you can't say that somebody that's been married to somebody, let's say for 60 years, that it's harder or easier for them than somebody, that's been in a shorter term, say, relationship, or that it's not as difficult for the adult child because they're not married to the person. They're all challenging in their own right. With spousal and partner caregivers, what I see a lot and what I try to help my clients with is their struggle between being a we and being an I. And what I mean by that is that, so they're married to somebody, say for 60 years, but maybe their spouse doesn't remember them anymore, doesn't remember that they're married. They don't feel that, they don't have the same kind of relationship anymore. And I mean, I've had clients over the years who were spouses that really felt like they missed the intimacy. They wanted to be with another person, but they were still married. And so really helping them in some ways grieve over the we, and yet still help them hold on to some aspects of the we, and then help them, work through learning how to be an I, and perhaps having lots of friends who are still we's. And so now they've got to figure out, a new way of being in the world with people who are either divorced or have, lost their family member, their spouse through a death. And I remember one of my clients saying this to me. He said, I was losing my wife and at the same time trying to find her. And, you hear a lot of spouses saying, I don't recognize this person anymore. This is somebody who never would have said the things they're saying to me or done some of the behavioral things that they're doing. Because sometimes what happens, as we all know, is the executive functioning part of the brain actually can become, affected to a point where the social filters are no longer there. And they can say some things that can be embarrassing, or just one woman who was very Christian, her daughter couldn't believe how much she was swearing. And so it's that kind of stuff that we have to try to help educate. Sometimes I'll actually bring a copy of a brain, picture of it, and I'll show the different lobes of the brain and what they're responsible for. And it really does help the adults understand, even kids, why some of these things might pop up in terms of what they're saying or the behaviors that they're doing with one another. When my mother had diagnosed with probable dementia, I also recognized, and I saw this a lot with the adult children in particular, that I wanted to find a way that I could still hold on to my role as my mother's daughter and my mother as my mother. And I'll never forget, thinking about, okay, yes, my mother sometimes didn't even know who I was. Sometimes she thought I was her mother. But when there were, moments, and that happens, where she did remember who I was, I wanted to make sure that, the two of us could share in that. It was a blessing to me to know that at that moment in time, my mother kind of knew who I was. And then there are other times when she didn't know who I was, but I still felt like I wanted to make sure I could give her some opportunities to be my mom. And I'm going to give you some examples of that as we go on. Same thing with spouses, helping them find opportunities and ways that they can still hold on to aspects of their relationship, even if it's just holding on to the love that they had towards one another, if they had that. And another thing that can happen is, it's not always the case, but every once in a while, a relationship that wasn't so great, I'm not talking about a toxic relationship, but one that wasn't that very close, the person with dementia can sometimes change and become warmer and more loving. So there are opportunities to give people this, if we give them the space and help them, as I say, sort of mine out, what might still be left that they can, work on together. Okay, so let's go to the next one here. So these relational changes, what we have to try to do with our clients is, and the families, is to help them see the shifts and sort of prop them up a little bit by giving them time to sort of process that and talk with them about, okay, because sometimes what adult children will say, I really don't feel like I'm a daughter or a son anymore because my parent is dependent on me. And I think Rabbi Dale mentioned about this whole thing around role reversal and role change. Mm-hmm. And she and I both have an agreement around this, as many of us in the field do. It's not a role reversal. And this is something I really, because the parent doesn't become the child and the child become the parent. What happens is they become dependent. And we as professionals want to help the families grieve through some of that change and loss, and then recognize, that they can still be that daughter or son. I remember I was working with a son, and he used to dread, the word, the big D dread word, visiting his dad when he would go over to his father's home, because he felt like they had nothing in common anymore. And so I started to talk to him about that. And I said, well, what did you used to have in common? He said, oh, Dad and I, we would go to these car shows together. We loved talking about cars. And, we really enjoyed looking at different, the mechanics of the car. And so I said to him, well, perhaps he, and his dad couldn't go out anymore. His dad was in a wheelchair. It was very difficult to take him places. I said, why don't you get Car and Driver magazine? And why don't you look through some of the pictures in there? The other thing he mentioned too was that his dad had a very short attention span and would get easily, kind of agitated and fidgety. And so I told him, you can do this in increments. You don't have to, you can spend 10 or 15 minutes when you're at the house with him, and then maybe, stop for a little bit, and then maybe turn on find a race driver car, something or other that he can watch together. So there's lots of different ways that you have to, what I call, adapt to accommodate to where the person is. And then another thing that people often say, especially partners, is that, am I really still married if my partner doesn't know me anymore? And when I was conducting a support group for spouses, one of the things that came up in the group was, I love my spouse, but I miss the intimacy, not only just the sexual intimacy, but I can't really have the same closeness that I used to share. And is it okay if I go and I date? And I was really impressed because even back 25, 30 years ago, when I was doing this at the Jewish home, 40 years ago, I was amazed at how many spouses said, yeah, it's okay. It's okay to go ahead and go bowling, with somebody that you enjoy being around. So I wanted to, Allison, if you could pull up, this is an incredibly powerful clip of a mother and daughter, and how they just relate to one another. I used to do this with my mom a lot. I used to lay in bed with her when she got to a point where she could no longer even sit like up in a wheelchair or a jerry chair.
Do you know you're my mama?
Uh-huh.
You do?
Uh-huh.
A while ago you said you didn't know you were my mama.
Well, you act like my mama.
I act like your mama?
Mm-hmm.
No, I'm saying you're my mama.
I'm your mama?
Yeah.
All right, I'll be your mama.
Now, do you think that I would lay here with just anybody?
No. I think you want to have to love them if they want to.
Yeah, you do have to love them to lay down with them like this.
Yeah.
And I love you, mama.
I love you.
But do you know who I am, though?
Uh-huh.
Who?
Kelly.
Yes, mama. Yes, I am Kelly.
Uh-huh. Well, I love Kelly. And didn't I name you Kelly?
Yes, you did.
Well, I love you, Kelly.
I love you, mama. I thought a while ago you didn't know who I was.
I know it well. It was something because when I have some fears, I get here and I'm thinking, my Lord, what in the world am I thinking about?
You are?
Yeah.
What are you thinking about right now?
Well, I'm loving you.
I'm loving you too, mama.
Oh, well, we're both doing the same thing, aren't
yeah, we are.
Oh, isn't it wonderful?
Yes, it is.
I'm going to need to pull up the share the screen again, but that to me says it all. I mean, it is just so beautiful and powerful to see something like that. And again, it's such a prime example of showing, how somebody can still provide an opportunity to really appreciate their relationship. And what I found with a lot of my clients was that the adult children really felt like, well, if my mother doesn't know me anymore, or their short-term memory is blown, and even maybe their long-term memory, what's left? And really what's left is the heart. And I always say to people that the heart remembers, and that if you can tap into the heart with people and help families do that, then there's a way for people to still feel that they can have, still have some sort of a relationship together. One of the things too that comes up a lot for clients, I was just talking with a caregiver yesterday. In fact, her husband had a stroke, and it impacted his executive functioning. Now he has dementia from it. And what's amazing is that his short-term memory is actually pretty blown, but his long-term memory is sharp as can be. And he's driving her crazy. They've been together, they've been married for like 50 years or so. And And she just feels like, when is this going to end, this ambiguity? I don't know from time to time when I visit with him, what he's going to be like. Sometimes he, is very agitated and because he's not sure who I am. And then other times he knows who I am. And I really feel exhausted from this. And it can be very stressful and confusing for caregivers, this ambiguity. And there's a book that Pauline Boss wrote that I love. She's kind of the guru queen of ambiguity. She's done a lot of work around that. And it's called Loving Someone Who Has Dementia. And she spends really the entire focus of the book on looking at how to help families deal with this ambiguity, because there's no closure, which makes it very hard, and it's unclear. And they often, you'll feel like the person with dementia is absent and then present. And all of us that work in this field know that in many ways, if there's been a death, then you can get some closure because the person has died. But when somebody has dementia and they're living with it for quite some time, and the person is present and absent, it's a lot harder to travel that road with the person. And like my client said to me yesterday, she said, this is a terrible thing for me to say, but I really wish he would die. And I've had many, many clients over the years say that to me. And then of course, she's Christian, and she said to me, I know that, I can't have any control over that. And if it's God's will and all that. However, we did spend some time just being able to allow her to feel her feelings. And, she's not a person that cries very much, but she was able to shed some tears during the session that I had with her. And I was able to give her permission to feel the way she feels. And it's not easy for us to hear that something like, I wish he was dead,
Nancy, if this was, we have a couple of comments that I just wanted to get into you before
Sure.
we go on. So two people really wrote about the video, and they said it was beautiful and they really found it to be very moving. So thank you for putting that in. Another one of our participants commented that oftentimes there will be only one child or one relative who maintains contact and visits, and the other family members see to that person. And that's absolutely true. And then somebody else said one issue to face is how to navigate family not telling the patient that they have dementia, not wanting them to find out.
Yeah, I've gotten that a lot over the years. And I think that a lot of it, my feeling about telling the truth with anything is that if you always had a relationship in which you shared the truth with one another, whether it's an adult child, with a parent or a spouse, then you want to be able to tell the truth. And sometimes it's helpful if the adult child or the spouse is really having a hard time saying to the family, the person who has dementia, you have Alzheimer's or you have cognitive impairment. It can be helpful to have a doctor present or a nurse or maybe a social worker. Like I've done a lot of that, with my clients, where I'll sit with let's say the couple, and the wife has dementia, and she may even be in denial, or maybe she's just not aware. And what I try to do is, I may not say you have dementia or you have Alzheimer's, but what I might say is, what we've learned, you had a physical and your brain isn't working, the way it used to. It's had some maybe little strokes, or, there's something. And I bring my brain picture because honestly, I have found that to be so helpful for people. But I really believe strongly that it's important to tell the truth. Now, here's where, there a double-edged sword for me anyway, and everybody has to do what they feel comfortable. There's a point where I believe when somebody's dementia is at a point where they really don't have they have no short-term memory, and they don't really have, their long-term memory is not great. And where I talk about therapeutic line or compassionate, I call it compassionate deception. And what I mean by that is that, you know, if somebody who's got pretty significant dementia and they keep on asking the same thing over and over, where's my husband? You know, why isn't he here? And if you keep on saying, well, he died, don't you remember he died? Or he's no longer here. You know, what I used to get when I would do that is they would say, well, why didn't you tell me? You know, and then I'd say, well, I did tell you, you know. And so now I don't do that anymore. I just say, I go on to say, I don't say that he's dead, or I don't say he's alive. I say, let's talk about your father or your mother or your spouse. What are the things you really love about that person? And I find that that sort of helps deal with some of this business of, you know, when somebody's memory is such that they just can't retain really important facts, but you don't want to use compassion. You would never use compassionate deception or therapeutic line for somebody who doesn't have dementia, that's for sure. And even when they do, like I said, they've got to be in that less abled or more unable place. And I'll get into those categories a little bit and might help you understand it. So yes.
Nancy, one participant just wrote, actually, she finds often someone increasingly suspect that they have dementia, but they fear saying it to their partner. And meanwhile, the partner is trying to avoid telling the other partner. So both feel they're walking on a thick wire around around each other.
Yeah, and I think that happens a lot because we still have such fear and dread about dementia and getting Alzheimer's or any kind of dementias. And because we also, you know, we revere intelligence and cognition and all that. And that's why I think that that's where you see these partners dancing around things, and where you need to get other people like us professionals, chaplains and social workers, to help the family members talk through this stuff and to be able to share with one another. I think sometimes spouses in particular, they feel like they don't want to be what they think mean or cruel. Like if they were to say to their husband or wife, partner, you have Alzheimer's or you have dementia, you know, that feels cruel to them because they feel like there's no cure. And, you know, we've put so much, you know, awfulness to this whole thing. And, you know, what I've spent my career doing is trying to help people get out of that place of feeling like this is the worst thing in the world. I mean, there are times when it is incredibly painful and incredibly difficult, but there can be, you know, joy and grief and pain with dementia, they can coexist. And I really try to help mine out some of the joy. So, so this particular quote here says, it seems that when I just get used to one loss, I have to cope with another. The hardest part about being with my mother or my spouse, you know, you can put in partner through Alzheimer's, is losing the person in little bits. And again, think about our culture. We're not very good at dealing with grief. You know, we're not very good at dealing with loss. We don't talk about it enough. And absolutely, dementia brings forth grief and great sadness at times, for sure. And so what I like to do with my, a lot of the work I do with my families is educational, you know, really helping them understand the different types of grief. So I'm going to go through this for a minute. With dementia in particular, knowing that people can live with it for quite some time, anticipatory grieving is something that caregivers often will experience. And then on top of that, as the person declines more cognitively or physically, then there's more grief. It's like they're re-grieving. That's why they call it sometimes, you know, the long goodbye. But it also gives us as professionals an opportunity to help people, help the caregivers begin the process of letting go and saying goodbye to the person, and perhaps first saying goodbye for themselves, working with them in terms of recognizing that they are kind of losing the person in bits and pieces, but they're not losing the spirit and the heart of the person. And that's an incredibly important thing. The other thing about dementia is that it's what I call a disenfranchised grief. It's a grief that's not recognized or understood or legitimized by our culture. And I have to tell you, I will never forget this. I mean, it's still deep in my heart. I remember one of my dear friends said to me, she goes, well, she'd ask me periodically, how is your mom doing? And I'd say, well, today I went and visited my mother. She didn't remember me. She didn't know who I was. And so then my friend said to me in a very caring way, she said, well, then why do you go? Why do you visit with her? And I said to her, I visit with her because I love my mother, and she may not know who I am, but I know who she is. And it doesn't matter to me, because that's where I recognize the importance of the spirit and really learning how to engage my mother's spirit and my spirit. So there's a lot of education that's needed in terms of helping folks understand that just because somebody has even, severe dementia, they're in that unabled place, does not mean that we still can't find time to be with them and to engage with them and, heart to heart. Now, I just want to also say, this is all great if you've had a good relationship with somebody. And I do think that sometimes we have to give, whoops, I got to go back here, I messed up. We have to give people an opportunity to realize that if they didn't have such a good relationship, give them permission to not necessarily visit so often, or if they are going to visit with somebody, have somebody go with them, not do it by themselves. What I messed up around with the slide, and I'm not 100% sure how to get back to it, was just the normalizing grief, that it's important that people understand that they are going through a grieving, and that that's a normal thing, and that if they don't allow themselves to grieve, then they can get stuck. And it makes it so much harder to be able to really get to this place of recognizing that and accommodating to the changes. So another big thing that families struggle with is communication, particularly as somebody declines more. And Olivia Huxtable, who's one of my very favorite authors, wrote a book called 10,000 Joys, 10,000 Sorrows. And she said, I felt like I was an archaeologist of the mind. Her husband had Alzheimer's, digging for meaning. I dusted off phrases, hoping to discover treasures hidden beneath the surfaces of garbled speech. And I smile when I read this, because I have times when I would get with a client and I absolutely had no earthly idea what they were saying to me. However, it didn't matter, because I could tell through their body language and their spirit what they were saying. They were basically saying, to me that they were sad, or they were saying to me that they were excited about something, or they were feeling joy. And so I learned how to communicate so differently without the expectation of having a regular sort of conversation, with somebody that has dementia as they, lose more ability. So what we want to try to do and encourage families to do is to keep it simple, stay on maybe one topic, don't go running around to them a lot of different things. The one thing I say over and over again, don't correct the person. If the person says something, my mother used to always say certain things to me that I know were not correct. And I just let it be. I had to learn, we can change. The person with dementia really can't. And so it's up to us in a sense. And then use pictures as much as possible. Rabbi Address gave us a lot of examples of different ways, and resources that we can use. I used to read to my mother. I would read very short little, maybe sometimes quotes, or I'd find pictures and show them to her. And then, I sat with a client once. I will never forget this one either. 92-year-old woman, had dementia, would basically sit in her apartment with her caregiver and never say a word. But I found out she was a school teacher. And I went to the library and I asked the librarian if she could find me a book of children around the world. And I don't know what inspired me to think about something like this, but I did. She found me this book. It was the coolest thing. I sat with my client and we went through all the different children from all over the world. And this woman talked to me. And she was talking to the children in the book and saying how beautiful they were. And her family, back then you didn't have, phones and stuff like that. When I was doing this, I would have recorded it. It would have been amazing. And then utilizing the senses, of course. I cook. I bring electric skillet with me, and I would cook with my clients. And then it would bring up some smells or tastes. Or I used to do a spa day with one of my gentlemen who had a baldness right between his head and then little wings on the side. And I would massage his head and he loved it, and we would sing Amazing Grace, and I would, different songs that he really loved. I learned as a Jewish person that I needed to know a lot of different songs. And I have an incredible Christmas CD collection, by the way, because it was important, So when my mom was diagnosed with dementia, I also realized that I was going to have to find some new ways to be with her. And that's what kind of spurred me on to this book that I wrote called Meaningful Connections, Positive Ways to Be with a Loved One Who Has Dementia. Because what I found with my clients is that there really was a lot of challenge and difficulty with how to visit with somebody, how to spend time with somebody. And certainly we see that even in our memory care units, in our nursing homes, the kinds of sort of engagement activities to me are really pitiful. And, we need to give, again, people meaningful engagement, ways that they can feel like you don't just have them take a bean bag and throw it in these holes and tell everybody to clap when it goes in the hole. I mean, what kind of meaningful, connection and engagement is that? But to be able to, sit with somebody and pray with them and talk a little bit. Like I have the story that I wrote about the doctor's hands, and it was a beautiful visit. It was one of probably the most fantastic visits I ever had with a client. Really and truly, he was a gentleman who was well known as a physician in Atlanta, and his family had hired me to go visit with him a couple of times a week because they were struggling with how to visit with him. And then I would come back and give them ideas. Well, one day I went and, they paid me for this. And I went to see him and he was in his jerry chair and he was sound asleep. And he would, I put my hands on his hands and didn't wake him up. And I thought, okay, they're paying me. What am I going to do here? And then I got this idea. Why don't I just sit with him? Why don't I just hold his hands, sit with him? And what I told him was the stories he told me about all the times he spent with his patients. And I remember him telling me, doctors don't touch their patients enough. Nowadays they come in with a computer and they just write everything down. And so I just sat with him the whole time. And then next time I went to visit with him, I brought some cream in case he was sleeping again. I could maybe put some cream on his hands. And I shared that visit with two of his daughters, and they started crying. And, they said to me, I never thought about that. I always felt like when I went to visit, he had to be awake. And we had to talk a little bit. And so I think about the importance of just having a healing presence, just being present, which that's a blessing. I mean, to me, dementia has so many blessings that we get from working with folks. You know, the idea of being able to just be present with somebody, to sit with my mother and watch hummingbirds in the garden of the Jewish home, which my mother never would have done in a million years, but now she and I were doing that together. And that was something new in her life. You know, just things that you get to do that you never would have done in the busyness of life. So that takes me to this whole thing about dementia abilities continuum. And this is what I found to be the most helpful in order to help families visit with somebody. And so I talk, you know, very simply about, you know, what does it mean to be more abled, less abled, and unabled, and then how do you spend time with that person based on that. And I want to note something here. I didn't use the word disabled. I didn't use the word dis, because I think when we dis something, like disease is dis-ease. And I always think about our goal is to help people, help families be more at ease, and help the folks that have dementia be more at ease. And so what I tried to teach in this Meaningful Connections book was helping them look at how you would take, say, like if you're reading to somebody who was more abled, they might, you know, usually their short-term memory might not be so great, but their long-term memory is still relatively good. They're still able to focus fairly well. And so you can read, you know, maybe a very short story to them, and maybe show some pictures around it, and maybe even have some dialogue. And that's kind of a more able person. Then if the person was less abled, then if you did a story with them, when a person who's less able, their short-term memory's usually not there at all. They're starting to have a little bit more long-term memory issues, but you can still read to them. It might be a sentence or two. And then you maybe try to talk with them about it, or you show them pictures, and then you stop. You don't expect them to sit through a longer, you know, story. In an unable situation, you might be able still, like if somebody really enjoyed the, you know, think about it, young children, 1, 2, even 3, we read to them, right? And I don't know if you've ever been read to as an adult, but it's delightful. It's really nice when somebody reads to you. And so I would go often to some of my clients, and even if they were in that unabled where they were laying in bed, and I wasn't even sure if they were aware or not aware of my presence, you know, I would just read something really relaxing or funny or whatever it might be. And it was just a way of, again, giving them an opportunity and me having a way to connect. And it might be that when I'm reading to them, if the person's less abled or unabled, I may be holding their hand. I might have my arm around them, again, making sure that they're not afraid of me. I learned that you don't want to sit in front of somebody. You want to sit on the side with them, because when you're in front, they feel a little bit more threatened. So I created these what are called activity grab and go boxes. And this has been a lifesaver for some of my families. They've told me this. So it's really cool because it can be an intergenerational kind of thing where you get your grandchildren or great grands to put together a box. So like, let's say I had a client who was a big Detroit Tigers fan. And even though he lived here in Atlanta, and so I had the grandchildren, I told the adults about this, the adult children, put together a baseball box, have a Detroit Tiger baseball cap, have Cracker Jacks, peanuts, have the song Take Me Out to the Ball Game, the words, and sing it together, you know. And so it's a lovely way of visiting with somebody. A toolbox. I had a gentleman, actually, this man I went to the home of this gentleman at the time, and we put tools all around the house. And then he would go to different sections of the house and he kind of fidget with the tools. And that was a meaningful activity for him, you know, and it kept him engaged. And then the daughter would sometimes go over to where he was, you know, long as it wasn't a saw or something, you know, that would be dangerous for him. Same thing with the bird box. I had a lady, and there's all kinds of different boxes you can do, but she was a big birder. And so I asked the children to put a bird feeder outside of her window. And we had binoculars and we looked at birds. I found a really cool book of birds around the United States of America, and it had all the different bird sounds. So these are really lovely ways to help people visit. Last but not least, I want to mention,
Nancy,
I'm trying to get too much in.
We have a couple, we have an hour and a half, so we have plenty of time. So one person writes that some people are afraid, they're really scared to touch the skin of an older person. And that's probably true. That's probably true. Somebody else wrote, how does one know whether the hummingbirds were meaningful to the one with dementia or to the one who was accompanying them?
Okay, two good questions or comments. First of all, I think that the way to get people to be a little bit more comfortable touching an older person's skin, again, you have to be very respectful. And my feeling is what I used to do with my clients now with the guy that I rubbed his head, you know, I had a really outstandingly great relationship with him, and he knew who I was, even, you know, he knew my spirit even when his dementia got so impaired, and he was comfortable. But I always start with hands and bring cream. And that way, you know, nice smelling cream, it kind of makes the person who's putting the cream on, it smells good. And therefore, you know, it's dealing with the senses, and it helps people feel a little bit more comfortable with touching an older person. I think sometimes we're afraid of touching an older person, we might hurt them. You know, we worry about breaking bones and things like that. You know, I'm not quite sure. I haven't really bumped into that one too much. I mean, I give families ideas about, you know, spa days, you know, where you get to, like I used to do that with my mom. And I did that with a couple of my clients where I brought, you know, I would get a basin where they were living and put some really nice warm water in there and, you know, put it over their face and put it on their hands. I always started with their hands, always with the hands first, see how they react, because you don't want people to be frightened in terms of what you're doing, you know, around touch. And what was the, I'm sorry, I missed, I got so, what was the second question or comment?
Yeah, let me get back to it.
Yeah.
Whoops. It was, how does one know whether the hummingbirds were meaningful?
Okay, yeah, that's right. So again, I think if we look at the mostly abled, less abled, and unabled, I think what I found was that with the hummingbird example, and my birder woman, I mean, she clearly was able to remember. She was in the more able place, and so she loved it. I mean, she absolutely loved it. When people have more difficulty with being able to understand what they're seeing, because sometimes what happens, as we know, is dementia moves around the brain, particularly if it's Alzheimer's dementia or where it is in the lobe, people might have difficulty with seeing and interpreting and that sort of thing. So, you know, I would, hopefully you get an idea of what the person understands and doesn't understand. And then you have to keep on learning how to adapt. I can tell you that there was a gentleman I was working with at a nurse. I would go and visit him at the nursing home. And I noticed as his dementia, when he got into that place of less abled, I used to take him outside and we go to the koi pond in the back there, and he loved looking at the fish. And he and I would watch him, and then we would, you know, feed them and all that. But as his dementia, got worse, he wasn't able to even see the fish in there. And he didn't really even, I don't think, know what the fish were. So then what we would do is we'd go into the gazebo, and there were wind chimes in there, and he loved the sound of the wind chimes. So I kept on having to adapt, you know, and sometimes it'll work with, and then as time goes on, or maybe one time you visit with somebody and they're really sharp as all get out, and other times they're really not, you know. My mom went through, I share this because I never knew. The one thing I could tell you that I find, you're never bored when you're working with people with dementia, because you don't know exactly what you're going to find. And with my mother and the visits, and I tell this to my clients a lot, I never knew if I was going to be my mother's mother, if I was going to be her best friend, you know, or if I was going to be her daughter. But my mom went through this period where she thought she was dying. And that was hard because, you know, and it scared me a little bit because I didn't know, you know, does she know something I don't know? And so I actually talked to the staff, and they said, no, she's really in good shape and there's nothing wrong. You know, we're not seeing any UTIs or any of that kind of stuff, urinary tract infections. And so that day I went to visit her. She said to me, Nancy, I got to tell you something. She was very able to talk to me, even though she was in that less able place. You know, she had this spark of cognition. And she said, I got to tell you something. I said, what, Mom? She says, you know how I've been telling you that I think I'm going to die? I couldn't believe she remembered this. And I said, yeah. And she said, well, guess what? And I said, what? She said, I forgot to. She forgot to die. And so, you know, I just never kind of knew what I was going to be experiencing with her. And I think that's an important piece to talk with families about, is that's why, you know, you don't give up on folks, because you don't know when that synapse and everything's going to reconnect. And you can have, you know, a lovely experience, or you can have a horrible experience, you know. When my mom would think that I was her mother and they didn't have they had a very, not a good relationship, let me just put it that way, I would have to leave. I could tell, you know, she'd call me by her mother's name, Yetta. She was agitated. She would grab my wrist. And that's when I knew, after 10 minutes, even though it took me 30 minutes to get there, I had to leave. I had to give myself permission. So, which is why it leads me into this whole business of self-care. And I mean, I could spend hours on this one, because caregivers really don't think about self-care. And if you ask them why they don't do self-care for themselves, these are the things that come up. They don't have enough time. They're too busy doing everything else. They think they should, thou shalt not should on thyself, but they think they should or do everything and be able to do everything. And they don't want to ask for help. They're afraid of maybe being turned down. And they have unrealistic expectations of themselves. They sometimes feel that they're the only person that can really take care of the person, or they're the only person that knows how to visit the person. And so I really have to spend a lot of time with my caregivers, helping them recognize the importance of self-care, and to looking at how do we whittle down some of this to-do list that they have, and particularly around the holiday time right now, and teaching them about self-compassion, which is something that caregivers really don't think a whole lot about. And you know, I learned very quickly the importance of setting limits, because I didn't want to lose my own self and my life to my mother's illness. And I want to sit with that for a minute and let everybody have that sink in, because there's a concept that I read about through a colleague of mine called numb out, N-U-M-B, out, numb out versus burnout. And what I have found with a lot of caregivers is that they get to this place of numbness where you ask them, I mean, I've had caregivers sit in my office and I'll say, you know, what can we do? You know, what sorts of things would help you? What do you want to do for self-care? And they look at me like a deer in the headlights and they say, I don't know. I really don't know. And that's when I recognized that this numb out place is even more dangerous than the burnout place. Because with burnout, you eventually have to stop. You know, you have to say, I can't do this anymore. This is, I'm just burned out, I can't do it. But numb out is where you're so numb, you keep on doing it. And you kind of go through the motions. And so, which is why I wrote my book, The Mindful Caregiver, and the whole idea of mindfulness, you know, teaching caregivers about being mindful of their body and how it feels and what they're doing and how they busy themselves. And sometimes they do it because they don't know what else to do. They don't know how else to care for themselves. So spending some time with them on realistic expectations. You know, what is really realistic? What can you do? What are you doing because you feel that others expect you to do, or you don't want to, you know, have people feel like you don't care or you're not a thoughtful, caring, you know, person. And so you do these things. There's a wonderful book called Getting to Know. Getting to a Positive No is actually the title, by William Ury. And I read through that whole book and I thought, wow, this is big. This is important for caregivers, learning how to say no. You know, no, I'm not going to have Thanksgiving at my house this year. I just don't have it in me, you know. Or we can have it at my house. Let's either do a potluck, or I'm going to just buy stuff from Publix. Here in Atlanta, we have Publix. They make a good, you know, Thanksgiving meal, and it's going to be what it's going to be, and we'll be together. Another thing that I got in touch with in working with caregivers is what I call entrenched caregiver beliefs. And again, these are these beliefs that they hold on to about themselves, or that they have kind of believed that society thinks they should do. And so getting in touch with what these entrenched caregiver beliefs are, and realizing that every caregiver has their own beliefs about what they think they should do to be a good caregiver. And that sometimes what happens with these beliefs is they get caught up in their guilt. And so their guilt kind of, as I say, holds them hostage to their beliefs. And so as helpers, as pastoral counselors and social workers and people that are working with these folks, these families, is to help, you know, look at each of these different beliefs and how realistic are they, and which ones can you let go of, and what would happen if you let go of them, and then talking to them about being what I call self-full, and which is very different from being selfless or selfish. So a selfless person, and caregivers can quickly jump on that bandwagon. They know what that is. That's when I do everything for everybody and I take a really big back seat. You know, selfish is when I only do for myself and I don't really care how it impacts other people. That's generally not caregivers. Although they feel sometimes like they have to get to this selfish place in order to take care of themselves, which is why I came up with self-full. And really what self-full means is that you recognize what you can and can't do. You look at, how it may impact the person, and, whether it could endanger them or whether it's, a safety issue, whatever. And you give some of that up to other people, and you hold on to some of the things that are important to you because you don't want to lose yourself. So you become a self-full person. I'll give you the best example, a personal example with my dad. My stepmother and my father had chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and emphysema, and they lived in Florida. My stepmother calls me up and she says to me, I made a reservation to go to Cleveland to be with my sister, and I want you to come down to Florida and stay with your dad. And so she had already gone and made the reservation, had all her plans set up, and she expected me to come and stay with my dad. Well, guess what? My father was incontinent and he was in adult briefs at that point. And I did not feel comfortable. She didn't have a caregiver, taking care of him that way. It just wasn't comfortable for me. And so what I did was I called an agency down in St. Pete, a home care agency, and I hired with my own money a caregiver that was going to be down there when I was down there. So I told my stepmother that. Well, what she ended up doing was I told her that that's what I was going to do. And she said, that's just horrible. And she hung up the phone. And as it turned out, she didn't go. She canceled her trip and I didn't go down there. And it was very painful, because she and I were very close. And she wouldn't talk to me for weeks. And then my dad ended up in the hospital in the ER, and then in the ICU, and I ended up flying down, and he ended up dying on that time I went down there. And we had a whole conversation about this. And she had no idea that I didn't feel comfortable toileting my father, with the depend and everything, and because she had been doing it, So it was really hard for me to be self-full, but I had to be. And I talk to my clients about this a lot. Same thing with toxic family relationships. If I give my clients permission that if they've been sexually, verbally, physically, emotionally abused by the person that has dementia, they do not have to visit with that person or spend time with them. Or if they do, they bring somebody with them. They never go by themselves. This is what I share with them. And they find other ways, perhaps they do other things to help the person, but not be directly with them. And that's being self-full. And then there's all the ethical challenges for caregivers. And this can create a whole bunch of stuff between siblings. Now, the siblings, it's always interesting to me, the sibling that had sometimes the worst relationship with the family member wants to make amends. And so all of a sudden they're jumping to the plate, or somebody wants the money. And so who should be the power of attorney for healthcare and finances. And there's this big, it can be really challenging between the siblings in terms of how to, support the person with dementia. And I know with my own family situation, my brother was interesting. In the beginning, when my mother was more able, my brother would fly from Florida, because I brought my mom to Atlanta, and he had no trouble visiting with her. Then when she became less able, all of a sudden I noticed his pack with me that he'd come, at least every other month or so. He wasn't coming so often. And then when she became unable, once a year. And at first I was really angry with him. And then my own therapist, helped me to understand that that was just where my brother was. He wasn't able to deal with this, and that he missed out on a lot, quite frankly, because as my mother became less able and unabled, I found so many beautiful ways to be with her that he missed out on. But I wasn't going to hold that anger towards him because it just wasn't in the cards for him. He wasn't comfortable with that, nor was his wife for that matter. So you've got some of these things that come up during these challenges, and then the end of life issues as well. As my mom was really declining and she was in that unable place, and I knew that she was on hospice, I asked my brother, I thought, okay, I'm going to give it a try again. So I asked my brother if he would come with me to the funeral home to make the arrangements for my mother's burial. We were going to have a graveside and to pick out the coffin. He would not come. And I went by myself. And I wasn't angry with him. I was incredibly sad. And there was nothing I could do about it. I mean, it was a very hard thing to do, but I did it. And so I share this with my clients sometimes, you know, when they're struggling with their siblings, that, you know, we want them to do certain things. I mean, I try to say to families, you know, there are some siblings that are better at certain things. You know, my brother was willing to send $50 a month so that I could buy things for my mom, or, you know, give it pizza for the whole staff that was on her floor on her birthday. He could do that piece, but when it came to other stuff, he just wasn't comfortable. So the end of life issues can also be, and somebody made the comment about, well, what happens if the spouse is in denial? You know, one, denial that the person has dementia and doesn't think that they need any help. And I see that a lot. And it's very hard to work with, because if the spouse is competent, that spouse has the right to make, what I say, not good decisions for the person, you know, that they're caring for. Now, if the spouse that's competent is making decisions that impact the safety of the person, then that's a whole nother issue. And what I try to do with that is bring in a therapist, bring in the physician, you know, really try to get other professionals involved. And then sometimes families actually have to go for a guardianship, which is what I don't like to have happen, or a conservatorship, but sometimes these things happen. So try to avoid it as much as possible, and try to think about who has leverage with that spouse that's not willing to accept what's going on with their husband or wife or partner. And sometimes it's a best friend of the person that has dementia. Sometimes it's could be a rabbi, it could be a pastor, it could be a minister, it could, you know, could be a doctor, colleague, a work colleague. Because you want to get to this place of helping families finish well at the very end with dementia, and somebody has dementia. And then another thing that we have to do, especially social workers, I saw this a lot in my practice, is helping families navigate through the professional resources that are out there. You know, helping them understand, what is an elder law attorney? What does an elder law attorney do? What can financial planners do for you? What is home care? What's the difference between home care and home health care? Because there's a big difference. What are geriatricians? What are geriatric care managers? You know, the whole thing around elder care communities. A lot of families don't even know the difference between a retirement community and nursing home. And so helping them understand those differences and helping them be an advocate and learn about these things. Again, we have to educate them. Support groups, and you know, got to be careful with support groups, because there are some support groups that are wonderful, and there are some in which the person that's leading the support group doesn't have a clue how to lead the support group, and one person takes over, and it can really, you know, be a disastrous situation. So I used to try to find out, what are the support groups in town that I've heard good things about, or, so that I could direct my clients to those. So I'm pretty much, at the end here. What I did, there's a couple of other things that I wanted to read to you before I end, but I feel like the goal in terms of helping families is the word ease. How can we, we know that dementia is not an easy disease to have, but if we can find ways to help the person with dementia have more ease, to help the family that are caring for and supporting this person to have more ease. I mean, that's, to me, an incredibly important thing that we want to try to do for our clients. And I like to remind folks here, and I do this in a lot of my caregiver workshops, there's a beautiful caregiver Bill of Rights. And if you don't mind me reading this, and it says here, I have the right to take care of myself. This is not an act of selfishness. It will give me the ability to take better care of my loved one. I have the right to seek help from others, even though my loved one may object. I know the limits of my own endurance and strength. I have the right to maintain parts of my own life that do not include the person I care for, just as I would if he were healthy or she were healthy. I know what I do. I know that I do everything that I reasonably can for this person. I have the right to do some things just for myself. I have the right to get angry, to be depressed, and express difficult feelings once in a while. I did a whole session on anger with my spouses, and they loved it because, again, our culture doesn't, they're not comfortable. We're not comfortable with anger. I have the right to reject any attempt by my loved one to make me do things out of guilt or anger. It doesn't matter if she knows that she is doing it or not. I have the right to get consideration, affection, forgiveness, and acceptance for what I do for my loved one as I offer these in return. I have the right to take pride in what I'm doing. I have the right to applaud the courage it has taken to meet these needs. I have the right to protect my individuality, and I also have the right to life that will sustain me in times when my loved one no longer needs my full-time help. And it says author unknown. I really, really love that. And I just recently picked up another book that I love, that some of you may be familiar with. It's Kate Bowler's book, B-O-W-L-E-R. And I want to read something from it. It's called Good Enough, 40-ish Devotionals for a Life of Imperfection. And Rabbi Dale, if you're on this, Rabbi Dale used to always, I used to go to her often and ask her to give me a blessing, because I was dealing with some medical stuff, and also just her blessings were just so powerful. And I realized I never really had somebody bless me. I could almost start crying because it meant so much to me. And so when I saw this book about blessings for stuff, I thought, oh my gosh, I got to get this. And so a blessing for caregivers. Blessed are you, the carers, bone tired from doing for others what you would love someone to do for you. Blessed are you, pouring yourself out day after day. You are seen in your struggles and kindnesses and missteps, in your faithfulness and love. When you have poured out, what you have poured out has gone deep to the foundation that will last forever. You've created a bedrock of love. Yet, dear one, blessed are you when you see that it is now time to take some rest, time to be renewed and strengthened, awakened to see and welcome with anticipation what's next. Blessed are you who recognize that not everything has to be done right now, and not everything has to be done by you. Close your eyes and see them all, the army of those who have cared for you in the past, who have fought for you, who have loved you well, and drink it in, creating a pool of gratitude that swells inside. For blessed are you, having received and having loved, who can walk around with a thankful heart. Amen. So that's how I'd like to close.
Thank you, Nancy. We have about 10 more minutes left. So if anybody has any questions, please put them in the Q&A. And I see we already have 6. So somebody wrote that they like to comment about ease. Nancy, if you get that bill of rights to us, we'll be happy to post it onto the site along
Sure.
with the recordings. That's what somebody else asked for. Again, thanks for a wonderful program. Send the list of rights. And yeah, so and the last list of blessings as well. And please, if you could send the title of your books, that would also be appreciated by some of our panel, by some of our participants.
Okay, great.
Okay. Do we have anything else? Any last thoughts coming up? Okay. Seeing none, I'd certainly want to thank Nancy for the wonderful program that she put on. I want to remind everybody that we'll be back next week. It'll be another hands-on kind of a program. It's called Spirit Alive. I think you'll really find that to be a wonderful experience. So please join us for that. Please also make sure to fill out the little evaluation that we're going to send to you in a little bit. It's important for us to have those for the foundation. And again, we thank the Sephardic Foundation on Aging for their help in helping to fund this so we can sponsor it and bring it to all of us. If there's nothing else, thank you all for attending. God bless each and every one of you, and we will see you soon. Have a great day. Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov. Thank you. It's been a blessing to be with all of you.